Welcome to another installment of the 2021 Legends of Simpson Faculty Lecture Series, a 5-part virtual event featuring some of Simpson College's most beloved emeriti faculty presenting on topics that are near and dear to their hearts. Today's lecture features Simpson College alumnus and legend Dr. Fred Jones, a 47-year member of the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice, as he presents Race and the Shackles of Tradition.
In 1962 and graduated in 66. I think all four of us, we all came from Osceola, Iowa, and all four of us think choosing Simpson was a great deal. There are 3 PhDs and 1 physician out of those 4 people. I had, as a student, some great professors. Dr. Everett Lanning, my mentor, he was a wonderful professor, an even better man. Professor Kuntz, rather. I didn't realize how famous he was until I went to graduate school at Mississippi State to finish my PhD, and all the graduate students are reading his work down there in rural sociology. I don't think he ever told anybody up here how well published he was. Some professors from the old Vital Center program, Ed Sell, Adjunct, Fred Holder, wonderful professors. I've had great colleagues at Simpson over my 47 years as a full-time faculty member, and I continue to teach 1 course a semester since my retirement. So of my 77 years, 54 of them have been associated with Simpson in some way or another. In addition to my brother and I, my wife Julie is a Simpson grad. My brother Floyd's wife is a Simpson grad. 3 of our 4 children are Simpson grads. And we have a nephew who's a Simpson grad. We have a lot of connections with Simpson College. I'm going to try to do 2 things today in my presentation. First, I'm going to try to demonstrate that there's no anthropological basis for assuming that any race is superior in any way to any of the other races. And then I'm going to try to demonstrate how culture impacts our notions about race. So the title of my presentation today is Race and the Shackles of Tradition. And I borrowed the term Shackles of Tradition from Franz Boas, who, in my opinion, is the greatest American anthropologist, cultural anthropologist of all time. He was the supervising professor at Columbia University, where he started the first graduate program in anthropology in the world. He was the supervisor for that first great generation of American anthropologists, including the 2 most widely read anthropologists, Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead. And Boas tells us that culture is our greatest gift. Our culture, not our social nature, is what makes us unique, Boas says, among all of God's creatures. So there are many social animals, but only human beings are the fully cultural animal in this world. But I think it's important to realize that culture can be limiting. It can be like putting blinders on a horse. The horse can see straight ahead, but has no peripheral vision. So part of reality is hidden from the animal. And likewise, our culture can shackle us by restricting our vision and hiding the truth from us. As humans were evolving, we can visualize how the anthropoids preceding us developed along certain lines that permitted the evolution of people as we know them today. Early humans lived in very small groups of a few families who moved about in search of food. Large groupings could not assemble in any area without starvation. These were not agriculturalists, they were not herders. They depended solely on what existed naturally in their environment. And so breeding populations were quite small. As groups grew in size, they broke apart, moved into new habitats. And breeding populations would have been small, probably 50 to 500 individuals. And if culture had not evolved, resulting in more contact between groups, reproductive isolation could have resulted in the development of several different species instead of the 1 species of hominids that we have today in the world. Physical anthropologists, the best known would be the Leakeys, have compared the 3 major racial groups in terms of characteristics that are thought to have been much more prominent in one group in early humans as compared to the others. Today, these characteristics are not uncommon among whites, blacks, and Asians, suggesting interbreeding over thousands and thousands of years. But again, each of these characteristics I'm going to just briefly mention was thought to be primarily found in one of the racial groups initially. I'm going to start with baldness, and I'm going to rank the groups, whites, blacks, and Asians. One is the highest rank, the most of a characteristic, and 3 is the least. So if you look at baldness, whites are 1, blacks are 2, and Asians are 3. It is thought that male pattern baldness was primarily associated with whites early on. But again, today we find balding in all of these racial groups, which suggests interbreeding. But still yet today, whites, men, and women tend to bald more frequently than do men and women from the other 2 racial groups. If you look at hair type, you take a cross section of hair and you look at it under a microscope and it's perfectly cylindrical, that person has straight hair. If the cross section is elongated and it's a little thicker on one side than the other, then that person has curly hair. So if you look at hair type in terms of curl, blacks are 1, whites are 2. Whites have the full range of hair types from straight to tightly curled, and then Asians are 3. Pigment or skin color is related to the amount of melanin that one has in their skin. And the more melanin, the darker the skin. So blacks are 1, Asians are 2, and whites are 3. And I'm going to come back to pigment again here in a moment. And then finally, looking at the Epicantic Fold. The Epicantic Fold is a small flap of skin that partly covers the surface of the eye. It's primarily found in Asians, although many whites have Epicantic folds. Oftentimes in whites, they show up more as you age. So I have Epicantic folds, for example. And then blacks are the least likely to have Epicantic folds. All of these characteristics are mutations of which provided advantage in operating in a particular environment. Mutations are changes in the genetic makeup of offspring that is distinct from either parent. Many physiological distinctions among the races, like skin color, are a product of advantageous mutations, most likely related to environments in which the races evolved. Most mutations do not provide advantage. For example, having 2 heads does not increase the likelihood of survival for a calf. If a mutation does provide advantage, it spreads through a small breeding population that was characteristic of early humans rather quickly. Genetic research, much of which was done at the University of Hawaii, indicates that about 200,000 years ago, a mutation in a female, most likely in Africa, enabled the development of the brain as we know it today. This female is truly the mother of all modern humans. So let's look at 2 of these traits that I just mentioned a minute ago, the Epicantic fold and skin color, and how they might provide advantage. It's thought that the Asian race first developed in a very cold environment. Extreme cold can do significant damage to eyes over time. The Epicantic fold is a mutation resulting in less of the surface of the eye being exposed and reduces the risk of damage by the cold. Skin color, which is not, by the way, a good indicator of race. So some people with quite dark skin are technically classified as Caucasoid, some of the people in India and Pakistan, for example. Though it's not a good indicator of race, it's a mutation that provides advantage. Having significant amounts of melanin in the skin is very beneficial to those living in tropical areas. Protects one from too much of a good thing, excess vitamin D production. White skin with less melanin is beneficial in colder climates like those we find in Scandinavian countries where there's less sunlight. Reduced melanin allows more sunlight to penetrate the skin to provide the vitamin D that is needed. Race was intended to be a scientific term, but to use race as such is arguably impossible today, in part because there is so much interbreeding. Most of the attributes, however, that we assign to race are cultural attributes that are not biologically based. We culturally define skin color as more or less desirable. Notions about athleticism is another good example of culturally assigned attributes. It's often argued that African Americans are inherently more gifted as athletes. I often hear this from students when I would teach a class in culture and anthropology. It is true that they dominate the NBA and NFL roster. During the Cold War years, the Soviet Union and the United States were in intense competition in many areas, including athletics. And there were several Olympics in which the Soviet Union earned significantly more medals than the United States. And they even defeated us in basketball. They did this with no persons of African descent on their teams. So to argue that one race is physically or mentally superior to another is racist, just as culturally defining skin color as more or less desirable is racist. The question we should ask is, why do African Americans dominate in so many sports in the United States? And I would argue that the reason is based on historical evidence. Historically, the most advantageous avenues to a better life in the US for Blacks was through the entertainment industry or through sports. Young whites might choose sports or entertainment as career choices, but they also had many other opportunities, such as medicine, law, teaching, engineering, that were, for all practical purposes, closed to Blacks. Aretha Franklin, Louis Armstrong, Joe Louis were important role models for young Blacks and demonstrated how one could be successful. Many people believed that Blacks didn't have the intellectual capacity to be successful in the traditional professions of law, medicine, and teaching. Therefore, they were unlikely to be admitted to colleges or professional schools. Simpson's history, as it relates to George Washington Carver, demonstrates how difficult it was for Blacks to be accepted into college programs. Carver entered Simpson after being told by the first school to accept him that he could not enroll, even though he was an excellent student, simply because of his color. Our cultural notions about race have shackled opportunity, resulting in the loss of many contributions that minority persons could have made for our society. You think how many contributions they have made, and then contemplate how, the disadvantage they've had. The contributions that are lost are staggering. So let's take a few minutes to look at how these culturally supported notions have shackled us in functioning of the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system, you want both a just system and a fair system. Sometimes people think these are one and the same, but they aren't. A just system is a system in which all persons, regardless of the categories that they belong to, are treated equally. So it doesn't matter of which race you are, your sexual orientation, your race, your religion, your ethnicity. It doesn't matter how much money you have in the bank if you have a just criminal justice system. A fair system is a system that takes into account the circumstances surrounding a particular event, such as a violation of a law. You will look for mitigating or aggravating circumstances. If circumstances are mitigating, then the punishment for the offense is diminished. If it's aggravating, then you increase the punishment. It seems that being Black in the United States is in itself an aggravating circumstance. Our national history, well, let me back up make one other point. Renison and Dodge point out that the US has a rather harsh criminal justice system compared to other countries. We incarcerate, they argue, at a higher rate than Russia, Iran, Syria, Iraq, and all other nations for which we have data. The US accounts for about 4% of the world's population, but 25% of the known people that are incarcerated in the world are incarcerated in the United States. Americans have this notion that harsh punishment keep people from committing crimes. Unfortunately, data doesn't support that. And so the countries that have the lowest recidivism rates are in Scandinavia, where people might get 3 months for a crime that we give them 5 to 7 years in the United States. But anyway, that's another lecture, another time. But our national history as it impacts Blacks processed by our criminal justice system it's dismal. The ideals found in the US Constitution appear not to apply equally to Blacks. Justice is lacking for Black citizens who are treated more harshly than their white counterparts. The attempt to make it difficult for Black persons to vote in some of the states, particularly Georgia and Michigan in the 2020 election, informs us that attempts to devalue and disenfranchise African Americans are still a factor in our society. Some states established Black codes after the Civil War. These laws differed from state to state, but in all cases, they placed the Black citizen at disadvantage. Some Southern states required that Blacks be contracted out to a white farmer by the first of the year or face vagrancy charges and possible incarceration. In addition, in some Southern states, obscene language by Blacks was criminalized, as was selling cotton after sunset. In the movie Green Book, there is mention of sunset laws that forbade Blacks to be out and about after dark and required Blacks to use particular hotels as they traveled in the South. Over the last 4 years, events have led to the unmasking of racist attitudes among many. Immigrants have been demonized as killers and rapists, even though our own government's statistics clearly indicates that first-generation immigrants have lower crime rates than those born in the United States. Far-right groups such as the KKK, Aryan Brotherhood, Sovereign Citizens, and the Proud Boys have made it apparent that notions of white supremacy are still present in the US. This is all related to white privilege and the Black Lives Matter movement. White privilege refers to advantages that white people have simply because of the color of their skin. Whites have greater access to quality health care, as well demonstrated in the current COVID pandemic, where minority people suffer much more in terms of number of deaths. We have better access to education, good jobs, better housing. The Bureau of Justice Statistical Evidence demonstrates that whites and African Americans are treated differently by the criminal justice system in the US. Comparative arrest data from 2016 indicates that Black non-Hispanic men were imprisoned at the rate of 2,415 per 100,000, or 6 times the rate of 400 per 100,000 of white non-Hispanic men. Iowa data informs us that in 2014, about 4% of Iowa's population was Black, but 35% of those housed in Iowa prisons were Black. Blacks are not only likely to be arrested and imprisoned more than whites, but they are more likely to be the victims of violent responses by the police. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor incidents point this out well, but it goes beyond this. A recent article by Dr. Monica Goyle in the Journal of Pediatrics covered a 16-year period. She found that Black children were 6 times and Hispanic children were 3 times more likely to be shot and killed by police than white children. Black Lives Matter activists do not argue, as some maintain they do, that white lives, Asian lives, the lives of indigenous people, and blue lives are less important than Black lives. What they argue is that it is apparent that white lives have always mattered in the United States, and they want Black lives to have equal value. I saw a placard carried by a protester in a Black Lives Matter march that read that one should assume or one should treat racism like we treat COVID-19. First of all, you should assume you have it. Institutional racism is so prevalent in the United States that it's hard to believe that in some ways everybody doesn't have it. We discriminate in subtle ways and we internalize behaviors associated with our institutions and rarely think about how those behaviors might put some people at disadvantage. So assume you have it. Second, the poster said, listen to the experts, don't spread it, and work hard to get over it. I'll finish with a quote from John Newton, who was a former slave ship captain who reformed and became a monk, was one of the leaders in eliminating English from the slave trade, and he is the author of the hymn Amazing Grace. And it sums up where I hope all of us end up as we try to deal with racism in our country. I'm going to quote him, and he uses the word man, but every place I use the word man, you could put in the word person. Quote, I am not the man I ought to be, I am not the man I wish to be, and I am not the man I hope to be, but by the grace of God, I am not the man I used to be. Very optimistic, and it points out we can change. And we should work hard to see in ourselves and in our institutions ideas that put some categories of persons at disadvantage and strive to eliminate behaviors that diminish others. Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to try to answer questions if anybody has some.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. And as Dr. Jones mentioned, feel free to send any questions you have through the chat. You can direct those to me through a direct message. Also, feel free during this question and answer time, if you'd like, you can turn on your videos. It's nice to see everyone's faces, and gives a little bit of the normal feel to it when we can see your face. So, any questions for Dr. Jones?
You know, I'm always great at clarifying questions. I can't always answer your questions, but I can always clarify them so well.
Okay, here is one that says, what do you see as the changes needed in our police force?
There's a lot of things that could be done to, I think, effect better policing. One thing that we need to emphasize more and more is community policing, and departments moving this way. But even when I was a boy in a small town here in Iowa, officers walked a beat around the square. Everybody knew the officers and so forth. We moved officers off of beats, walking beats, put them into cars. And so people in the neighborhood where they're serving don't even know who the officers are anymore. And so once officers and the community become more familiar with each other, I think we have more effective policing. We need much better training. We need constant training. I mean, particularly in regard to sensitivity for minority groups. I mean, officers train monthly with their firearms. It seems reasonable that they should frequently train with regard to racial issues as well.
Emily, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute, you can ask the question that you have.
Yeah, sure. Hey, Dr. Jones. My name is Emily Radke. I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions here at Simpson. Also a Simpson grad from back in 2008. I didn't have you as a professor, but I do remember going to a lot of your different lectures and things like that. So it's definitely great to have an opportunity to see you. I do have a question in reference to the beginning of your conversation in reference to culture. So I feel like now, especially after everything that happened last summer, and there's definitely been more of an awareness of white supremacy and how it has dominated American culture. Now a lot of things in Black culture and Latino culture, et cetera, are really starting to come to light. And while they may be new for some white people, they're definitely a part of the norm and a part of our history. So what are your thoughts on how white supremacy has dominated culture? And also to that effect, how has it also kind of dominated kind of how, we are policing ourselves and, with the violence, and really how it seems like anytime, someone is wrongfully killed, that's a person of color, there's always this question of what were they doing? Who were they? What was in their past, as opposed to respecting the fact that it was a human life that was lost for no reason.
We have, as part of the misinformation that many white Americans have about Black Americans, is the assumption oftentimes that they're likely to be more involved in crime. Now, what we know from self-report studies is really the crime rates for Blacks and whites are almost identical. Some variation of the type of crime, but crime rate's about the same. This whole mess with white supremacy coming to surface, of course, the political environment has encouraged that. And we've had such ineffective leadership in terms of trying to deal with some of the more outrageous assertions that politicians are made. Somehow we've got to get back to a place where we can actually communicate effectively and want to communicate effectively with each other. And sometimes we're just so uncivil anymore. It's not much civility in politics, between groups. The way that people are expressing racist attitudes today is very different than it was 10, 20 years ago. It's amazing. It just unleashed a willingness of people to verbalize their hatred. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I tried.
You definitely did. Gave me a lot to think about. Thank you, Dr. Jones.
You bet.
All right, we've had a few more submitted here. How did the dark chapter of slavery in our history contribute on to the institutional racism?
Well, of course, from the very beginning, once the slave trade started, African Americans were placed in positions where they were degraded. They were not permitted to achieve. People did not recognize their ability to achieve like any other people can. I think racism in the United States, people my age can remember colored fountains, drink, colored restrooms. I'll never forget when I was working my PhD in Mississippi, my son was ill, and I took him to the doctor, nice doctor's office, and there were no blacks, and so he got treated. And there was a side door that was closer to the parking lot where we're parked. So I opened the door and started to walk out that way, and a gasp, I mean, just a gasp came up out of the waiting room. And where we had been sitting was a very comfortable, air-conditioned waiting room. Where I was going out was a long hallway, chairs along both sides of the wall, black people. That's where the black people were. No air conditioning, waiting till all the white patients had been seen first. They're just these sorts of patterns that degrade people. We tend to internalize this stuff. Children internalize it, and as a result, we oftentimes perpetuate it in our own behaviors, even when we think we aren't. And that's part of that is the institutionalization of racism in our society.
Thank you, Fred. When looking at incarceration rates, what is the percentage of those imprisoned from low socioeconomic status versus higher?
I can't give you the exact position or exact percentage, but people of low income are much more likely to be incarcerated than are people of higher income. It's in the past, for example, let me give you an example. In the past, when we had crimes committed by a large company like Ford, let's say they sold $10 million worth of automobiles through false or misleading advertisement. In the past, they were regulated by some agency and they were fined. The CEOs and the people knew what they were doing. They knew what they were doing, but they were fined. So fined $100,000. Well, my guys, $10 million worth of automobiles, $100,000 fine. That's not going to stop the behavior. Now today, CEOs are being held accountable more, but a person that went into a convenience shop with a gun and robbed the clerk of $70 and was caught, he would go to prison for 7 years. The robbery is a serious crime. He might go to prison for 7 years, but the wealthy person in the past oftentimes wasn't dealt with by the criminal justice system at all, particularly large CEOs and so forth of large corporations. So poor people are easier to take advantage of. They have no power or very little power.
But it's fairly new.
We have another one here that asks, do you have any thoughts on how to deprogram white supremacists?
Records here in the US got it dropped off.
I used to teach a course in terrorism, and every expert in terrorism that I know has for 15 years been saying that the real danger is not from jihadists. The real danger is from the far right in the United States. People like the Proud Boys and so forth that we saw entering the Capitol. I tell you, I don't know quite what to do with them. There are some programs where people have sort of been deprogrammed, but it's a very expensive thing. And I think really basically what we have to do is get back to telling the truth. So we don't have all these wild conspiracy theories and ridiculous notions that people have about political opponents and so forth anymore.
Right. What do you make of the growing movement towards analytics and policing?
Well, I think it's a good thing. I mean, we're having more and more of our graduates that are becoming involved in that sort of things, like crime mapping and that sort of thing. So, for example, we had a group of students that helped crime map for the police department in Des Moines. And one of the things that they found was that the most rapidly growing area in the city proper was the South Side. So those analytics help us decide how we want to distribute our resources for policing in the future. And so it's very valuable tool.
Right. Many of us were never taught this in any history classes ever. Is this changing at all?
Well, I'm not a historian, but I know in my criminal justice classes, we talk about this stuff all the time. And I know in the sociology department, Carolyn Gallinger, who was a human rights attorney, and she goes to police departments and lectures. They bring her in to lecture on this type of issue all the time. So I think there's quite a bit of attention being given to it. And I know the first day of my class this fall and the first day of my class this spring, this is exactly what we talked about. So yes, I think more than ever.
Great. Thank you. David Colley from the class of 2002 says, I was one of your students from Toronto. I'm working as a homicide detective just outside of Toronto, and our service is now more active with equity and inclusion training. When you reference institutional racism, is that synonymous with systemic racism? What would you suggest is a common institutional racist practice in police departments?
Yeah, so basically we're talking, I think, about the same thing. Well, I know for a fact, I've known police officers that have told me that they are always suspicious, or oftentimes more suspicious of minority people. And I think one thing that police departments really need to do more and more of is re-socializing officers oftentimes. They are just like the rest of us. We've all been born and lived in this society that is that discriminates. And so the police officers are just like the rest of us, and we all need, in a sense, to be sort of deprogrammed. And the best way to do this, I think, is through education.
All right, this next one might be an answer that could be a lecture in itself, but we'll give it a shot. There's a discussion of how the notion of race arises. So the discussion of racism, anti-racism is complicated. There is no such thing as race, yet we must talk about racism, privilege, and more than this to get at matters of equality, justice, and humanity of man to man, the constitutional claims to self-governing democracy, and more. What ought we to think or do? Who ought we to be?
Oh, I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure I can even clarify that one. You know, when I think about good government and the way I would like the world to be, I'd look at the two documents I read are the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I am a firm believer in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And we need to behave in a way that demonstrates our commitment to those basic rights that we say the people have. And so often we don't do that. We just don't do it. Look how we've been trampling on the First Amendment in this country. Just it's horrendous. For 4 years, the chief executive of this country has bashed the media. And believe me, in a democracy, you need a media that can talk to power, talk to people of influence.
All right, here is another one that asks, do you feel that the assassination of President Lincoln prevented a much better change for slavery in the South?
You know, I really don't know how to answer that. I think President Lincoln was a great leader, but I'm not sure he could have done much more than he did after the Civil War, because a lot of people just hated him. I mean, in the South, nobody liked him in the South. So I think his taking the initiative to try to be more effective in the South very likely wouldn't have happened. But you know, I'm not a historian, so there's better people to ask that question than me.
All right, we have a question from Lisa Battern Larson, class of 1986. Can you reflect on how the issue of race on campus changed over your tenure at Simpson? How is it different now than it was when you first began teaching at SC?
Okay, well, when I came to Simpson as a student, there were 2 African Americans on campus. Fairly early in my career at Simpson, the college initiated a program and tried to bring in, and did bring in, large numbers of African American students. At one time, I think we had probably close to 90 African American students on campus. They didn't do it very wisely, not because they were trying to do good, but that we didn't have the resources that really we needed to have in place to deal with minority students. We, in some ways, brought them into an unfair environment. They oftentimes came from schools, inner city schools, where they hadn't had the type of education that oftentimes we would have expected of our students. And so we came to realize that we weren't doing these students a favor. And so the number of students then that were African Americans that enrolled in the college went down a lot. And of course, really starting, I would say, in a really serious way with John Bird. We have tried to recruit more and more minority students, African American and Latino students. And I think it appears to me that we've done a pretty good job attracting Latino students, still not adequate at all in terms of minorities, African American students. And I think one way you attract minorities to a college is by hiring staff, professors and other staff that are minority persons. And we haven't always been very successful at that.
All right, we have a few more minutes for questions. And one of them that has come in is, you spoke to racial stereotypes related to athletic proficiency. What about equitable assessments of IQs across racial identities? For example, we live in the Seattle area, which has a large Asian American population. The racial stereotype that is prevalent in our area is that Asian American students generally do the best in academics, in pursuits and testing. I suspect that this is due to cultural issues, not the IQs of the students. Can you please comment on this?
Well, that is true. The Asian cultures, the parents tend to put a great deal of emphasis on academic success. There's no difference in terms of the innate abilities intellectually of people of different races. They just aren't. Quite interesting. If you compare the IQ test scores of, well, actually they did this in right after World War I. Inner city blacks that were deprived, didn't have education that was adequate, and they compared the IQ test scores with people in Appalachia, white people, that had the same living conditions, poor, no education. The IQs were the same. There was also an interesting experience in which they built an IQ test score based on inner city experiences of minority people. And of course, African Americans and inner city people, Latinos and so forth that lived in the inner city, scored much higher on that than did kids from the suburbs. You have to always remember that test scores are based on some sort of a cultural basis. Where do people come from? Most of our testing is geared toward white middle class people. And so it's easier for them oftentimes to test better on those IQ test scores than it is for other racial groups.
All right, we've had quite a few more questions submitted, but I think we only have time for this last one. Sorry that we can't get to everyone's today, but this last question will be: civility seems to be gone from people's conversations. How do you think this has affected the racism we have today?
It makes people more intolerant. Is what it does, and it makes it very difficult oftentimes to talk to people in a meaningful way about race. And that's ultimately what we have to do. We have to talk about it. We have to try to understand where the African American, where the Latino American is coming from. Their life experiences are oftentimes quite different from those of us that are from the white middle class. You know, I did quite a bit of research in Des Moines a few years back, and I think most white Americans would be shocked at some of what you see. You walk into a person's home, there's no furniture. There's a mattress maybe on the floor, but there's not a sofa. Oftentimes there was a TV set, and that was about it. I mean, the life experience of can be so varied in this country, and we're so isolated from it. I mean, I went to a small high school, you know, about 600 or 700 people. There were no African Americans in my high school. The first time I ever interacted with African Americans was when our high school would play Des Moines schools in football or basketball. And still today, if you go to my hometown school, there are many Latinos in that town, but there's probably only maybe half a dozen African Americans in the school system down there. So, you know, we have very different experiences.
Well, with that, Dr. Jones, thank you so very much on behalf of everyone that was able to tune in here. We greatly appreciate you sharing your time and your insight on this topic. And thanks to everyone that did tune in as well. We hope that you'll join us for future lectures in the series as well. And everyone, please stay safe and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody. Bye, Andy.